Today on The State of Us, voters in the United States of America are being erased and our power subverted. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by none other than the friendly redneck liberal and senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. Today, we're going to look at how, map by map, both parties are gerrymandering districts across the United States and effectively erasing the will of the people. And that comes in two forms that we'll be looking at. First and foremost, when voters in different states, such as the great state of Ohio or New York, or a number of other states that have enacted legislation by the voters, mind you, that is specifically aimed at preventing gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, and then lawmakers just are like, we're just not going to do it. We're just not going to do it. We didn't care. We don't care what you say. We're just not going to do what you said. So we're going to talk about how both Republicans and Democrats are doing this across the United States. So kind of get the overview of what is happening, who it affects, and then talk about now what are we going to do about it. But before we dive in, Lance, what is the word of the day?
Using gerrymander. It's named after Jerry Elbridge, who was a U.S. statesman and vice president of the United States from 1813 to 1814. Gerrymander means to divide a voting area so as to give one political party a majority in as many districts as possible. So it's named after Jerry Elbridge, who was a founding father and former vice president of the United States. But the word of the day is vaunt. I love this. One syllable gives Justin a chance. V-A-U-N-T. For those English majors out there, it can be used as an intransitive verb or a noun, but the meaning is to boast about something, or as a noun, a boast or to brag.
So first up on the docket is New York's Democratic gerrymander. Democrats have drawn a map that gives them an 85% edge in House seats in New York. And you might be sitting there saying, well, New York is a blue state after all, right? So, I mean, is 85% really that unreasonable? Well, it's not quite that blue, because President Trump actually won 38% of the vote in 2020 in New York. So, by some basic math there, which I'm sure all of our listeners are quite capable of, they can figure out that that is a little bit more of an advantage than perhaps the voters of New York actually make up. So, likewise, if you take a state like Ohio, which is where Lance and I are and where we're recording from, we've been going through our own redistricting process, where only about 54% of voters voted for President Trump, yet the map that was drawn was in fact one where over 2/3 of our state legislative body would be Republican. So how do you get from 54% to over 2/3? Well, you do what they did in New York, right? The Republicans here are doing what the Democrats there did. And that is a direct, in Ohio, it's both. It is a direct subversion of the will of the voters of Ohio, who overwhelmingly, by the way, we're talking about over I think it was actually about 83% of Ohio voters passed a constitutional amendment to the state of Ohio requiring that redistricting be more fair, and not be as politically motivated. And so it directly subverts that will. And further, Lance, I think the contention here is we've talked a lot about, like with the Electoral College, for example, how much does one vote really matter? In other words, is my vote and a listener's vote from North Dakota equally valuable? Well, the answer is no, And that's not an opinion or an interpretation or extrapolation, or it's nothing. In a presidential election, the vote of somebody in North Dakota does not matter as much as Justin Weller's vote in Ohio. That's just reality. And this, in many ways, is very similar to that. When districts are manipulated and drawn this way to either lump in a little tiny bit of Republicans so that it can be a majority Democratic district, or vice versa, you are actively suppressing the power of their individual vote.
Well, you mentioned a couple of states, but we also see it going on the Democratic side in California, Illinois, and New Jersey. And GOP legislators are also doing it in Texas and North Carolina, along with Ohio, and then also New York for the Democrats. But so this is widespread, as you can tell by those states, in states where there are multiple seats in the House, because this is where the advantage becomes. You know, if you talk about North Dakota or South Dakota, as you did, very limited number of people's in the House, right? So the entire state is the district, or, you know, half the state in those states that have two. There's a couple out there, you know, who have 2 seats in the House, and it's pretty easy to split up. But in these larger states, this helps, you know, gain control of the House of Representatives at the national level. What's interesting from the state of New York, the map that the Democratic commissioners backed, according to one analyst, said that it left 9 House seats competitive for the GOP. 9 of 6 is 35%, which was in the ballpark of Mr. Trump's vote share. And the state legislature in New York could have accepted that, but they didn't. They took it upon themselves to redraw the map to cut it to 4. It's just the fact that these people, we know, all want power, but the power is supposed to rest in the hands of us, the American citizens. We give them directions. And in the case of New York, they actually even, I think that's a pretty fair map. You know, if the Republican candidate for president, take the name out of it, but the Republican candidate for president gets 35 to 40% of the vote, I think it's fair to draw a congressional map for the next 10 years that gives the Republicans 35 to 40% opportunity to win in the state house. That makes sense. I just don't understand the short-sightedness of all of this. I do. But I mean, I do understand, because they don't care. They just want to be in power now, and they're not looking about the future. And then what happens? Those of us who don't pay a lot of attention to politics, we just look at it at the national level and say, oh my gosh, the Democrats lost this many seats, or oh my gosh, the Democrats just won back the majority in the House. And we don't care, or care to even understand sometimes, all the backroom maneuvering that's going on in the redistricting of all these states.
Well, and like, for example, in the case of Ohio, right? I mean, it's the voters have even tried, I mean, I think in a number of ways, to hold their leaders accountable or change how their government is set up, because that's exactly what voters did. I think it was 2018, Lance, when we went to the ballot and voted, and it wasn't even put on by state lawmakers. It was citizen initiative,
right,
that put it on the ballot, which I don't know if our listeners, you know, are aware of this, but to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot without the support of the House or the state Senate, that's not an easy mountain to climb.
Right. You have to have people going out there, citizens going out there and collecting signatures and following, you know, and as we have found out locally dealing in politics, they don't make it easy. You know, we say, I mean, I remember teaching this every year in my American history class. We, the people, have the right to get laws passed on our own. We, the people, have the right to take out public people and put new people in. You know, we have those rights. That's guaranteed. But then when we started looking into some of that on a local level here a few years ago, oh my gosh, the politicians have made all these hoops that you have to follow through and all these deadlines to where it's almost next to impossible to follow all the rules. And of course, you don't follow one rule. They say, oh, can't do it. Even though you've got, you know, 90% of the signatures of the people of the state of Ohio, the voters, you can't do this because you didn't file it. You were 2 days late filing your paperwork.
Well, we'll keep talking about that. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. disenfranchising voters, both young and old, but particularly young, as Lance pointed out before we transition to this segment, is this notion that, well, supposedly there's systems in place, but gosh, those systems are really complicated to navigate and sometimes unfairly complicated to allowing the people of a municipality or of a state to change how they're governed. Yet, despite how difficult it is, which we, I think, have talked about a little bit already, for the people of Ohio to have changed their own constitution without lawmakers, they did it. We did it. It was really complicated, but Ohio got it done. And 83%, approximately, of Ohioans said, that's what we want. So it's not even one of those things where it's like, well, it's just barely half, so I don't know if we really need to do it. It's like, well, one, but majority rules, right? So like, yeah, if it's 51%, you got to do it. But in this case, it's sort of unequivocal. Like, there is no question that the people of Ohio clearly wanted this to go forward.
And that means there had to be bipartisan support.
Right. Well, because we already established that a majority of Ohio, by just barely, 54%, are Republican. So, right. I mean, it's literally impossible to have 83%. So to get 83%
to agree, you had to have bipartisan support to say, you know what, draw some fair districts. Draw some districts where there's competition so that we will vote, not because they're Republican or Democrat, because what they say they will do for our district. What do you stand for? What do you believe in? And first of all, before I get into it any further, I just want to thank you for listening, because to be full transparency here, I fought Justin for a couple of weeks to do this show because I was afraid people wouldn't listen, but not because I'm not passionate about it. So I'm glad that you're listening still. And because I am so passionate about this, it sounds like, well, this is the nuts and bolts of government. Who really cares? People, they're subverting our will, both the Democrats and Republicans. Okay. I'm not just railing against one or the other. They're both vaunting their opinions at us and saying, you know what? We don't care what you want. You're just the voters. We shouldn't take that from either political party, okay?
The sheer logic sometimes of lawmakers is astonishing because, like, for example, in Ohio right now, Lance, the Senate president is arguing that the map makers no longer need to follow anti-gerrymandering language in the Ohio Constitution that prohibits the plans from unduly favoring one party over the other, even though the high court struck down a previous map for that very reason. He says, quote, the unduly language does not apply because Ohio is facing an emergency that's threatening the May 3rd primary. The deadline for congressional candidates to file paperwork to run is Friday.
Then get it right the first time. You've already presented two.
If you had done your job.
If you do the job
back,
right,
back last year, right?
And I just have to point out, okay, we talk about politicians liking to speak. When the New York Times reached out to contact the state senator, who was a Republican, who sponsored the new map, he wouldn't respond for a comment. Really? Tell us why. We're just going to wait and fold our hands. Now we're going to come out and say, it's an emergency. We have to get this done. And that way we get what we want. And we're not going to follow the will of the people. Are you flipping kidding me? I can't, it's just, folks, please don't be taken advantage of by things like this. Okay. And I'm going to switch gears and Justin can bring it back, whatever. But when the next one is talking about the GOP chipping away at Black Democrats' power. And I just have to say this. The Republicans have shown in each election over the last decade to slowly be gaining more and more minority support. Why in the world, as a political party, if you're the Republicans and you're gaining support among minority voters, would you do anything like this that would hurt that growing support? This isn't even common sense, people. That doesn't even make sense. Well, more of these people are voting for us now, but we're going to do what we can to take away their voting rights and their voting power.
Well, and that's part of the problem.
What? More people are voting for you and you're going to attack that group? And then when it's time to go vote, you're going to reach your hand out and say, oh, yeah, well, we screwed you over a couple years ago, but now we want your vote, and we want your money, and we want your support. How dumb do these politicians think we are, Democrats and Republicans?
That's right. Well, that's because in New York, for example, part of what they talked about is Democrats who are unfairly hammering rural voters, because I know it's hard to remember, but the state of New York actually has lots of people who, do not live in cities.
Right. Upstate New York.
Right. And it's a very similar scenario of you're drawing them out of power, and then you expect them to, go along with you, and then you're surprised when they're upset because they don't feel like you represent them.
And either they vote against you, or the worst part is they don't vote at all. That's even worse, right? When people don't even go to vote because they're so frustrated with the system. But again, what does that allow? Well, if you have fewer people voting, you get your people out to vote, you get to stay in power. So I'm a politician not because I want to make the United States a better place. I'm a politician because I want the power. And so once I get the power, I want to stay in power. So now I'm going to do whatever I can with the rules to make sure I stay in power. I'm spending all this time so that I can stay in power. I'm not using the power that the people gave me to make people's lives better. That's the frustrating part about the politicians, Democrats and Republicans. They're both so concerned, it appears anyway, by reading these articles, of staying in power, that they're not doing what we elected them to do, and that is make our lives better. Pass laws and rules and spend money that we give them through our tax dollars to make our municipalities and our areas and our states better.
What a concept. What a concept.
What a novel idea.
What a novel idea. Because the point is driven home by the reality that, for example, in the Congressional District of Ohio that we are in, I think listeners of the show would know that, Lance and Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio are not exactly of the same political ideology.
We're not best friends. We're not besties.
No.
And in all fairness, we have talked before. Okay, Jim Jordan may not remember me, but I remember being in his office when he represented the state of Ohio in our district, and I talked to him about education, and it was a pretty one-sided conversation, but I did have my say.
And so, these are two, right? But Lance, because of the district he lives in, his vote for representative is effectively useless. I mean, and you say, well, is that really true? Well, just so you know, the most recent map that's been proposed in Ohio would give Jim Jordan 67.9% GOP lean in his district.
Gee, that's less than he usually gets.
Right. Yeah. Big.
They're kind of coming after him because he usually gets 85, 90%.
That's right.
Me and two or three of my friends are the only ones that vote against him in the county.
So it is a 67.9% GOP to 32.2%.
Now I'm vaunting, right? I'm being boastful here. I'm vaunting as somebody who votes against. But it's my right, correct? If I don't agree with what he's doing as my representative, then I have the right to vote against them. But to your point, is there even an honest race going on?
Well, and so see, for example,
people say, well, why don't you run against him? Well, I could, but
be realistic.
7 out of 10 voters are probably going to vote against me. Because of the Republican and Democrat thing, not about who's actually doing what for the people of our congressional district.
Because so that's Representative Jim Jordan's district, right? 67, almost 68% to 32%. So that's his district. And you say, well, so how does Lance's vote not matter as much in a district like that? Well, if Lance instead was in Captor's district, which is 49.8% GOP to 50.2% Democratic, well, now Lance's vote's very important, right?
And I guess our point, right, that we want to make very quickly is, for me anyway, and I'll let you have the mic back, but why isn't every district that way? Why not draw it so it's a 50-50 split, and then all of a sudden it matters whether you vote or not, and more people vote, and then the people who get elected would be beholden to the voters.
Whoa, what a concept. Now, I will say, just from a practical standpoint, when you look at a lot of different states across the United States, so there's a lot of debate about, what is a fair map, right? What is a fair map? Some people focus on a map needs to be compact, right? If you look at some of Ohio's districts, and this holds true in lots of different states, you would see that some of these districts not very compact. They span, like if we look at the proposed 5th Congressional District, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 counties that, to drive from one end of the other, especially because they are a rural area, probably take you hour and a half, maybe 2.5 hours, something like that, depending on what route you take. It's big, but it's not very deep. And so one thing but what it does do, and this was a common complaint about the old map in the state of Ohio, is it respects, for the most part, about 90% respective of county boundaries. So from that standpoint, it's a much cleaner appearance of the map. It's much easier for a voter to know what district they fall in, because that's another complaint, especially when you get into urban areas, it can be very complicated. If you look at Franklin County, which is where Columbus, Ohio is, the capital, you will see that it is sort of divided geographically about 50-50. While 50% of it is almost one district all its own, which is the city of Columbus, and then the rest of the county is lumped in to the 15th Congressional District. So the point here being that compact districts sound nice, but how do you do that if you also then want to do what Lance said, which is draw more competitive districts? Should districts be competitive? And the point here is that should lawmakers be doing a better job? Yes. Should they be better respecting the will of what the people of Ohio have requested? Absolutely. Is it possible to draw a perfect map that respects all of the different priorities? No, it is not. People have been trying. Lots of different rights groups have been trying in Ohio. Now, can you get a hell of a lot closer than they've gotten here? Absolutely, you can. Absolutely. So that's not to say that, this map is good. Is it better than what we have right now? Yeah, it is better than what we have right now. Can it be better than what it is and balance those priorities? Yes. Can it be perfect? Can it do exactly, compact districts, making all districts competitive, respecting minority voters? No, it cannot do all those things exactly right. It can just do a better job. So then we have to talk about, and that's what's coming up, what approach should states take? And is there room for a United States of America-wide sort of approach? Well, we'll talk about that. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. We've talked about in the show and been using Ohio as an example of a state that has attempted to improve this process. And I just want to share with you what the ballot language that Lance and I voted on says. And by the way, the other 8 out of 10 Ohioans who chose to do the same. It says the following: the proposed amendment would, first bullet point, end the partisan process for drawing congressional districts and replace it with a process with the goals of promoting bipartisanship, keeping local communities together, and having district boundaries that are more compact. Bullet point number 2, ensure a transparent process by requiring public hearings and allowing public submissions of proposed plans. Bullet point number 3, require the General Assembly or the Ohio Redistricting Commission to adopt new congressional districts by a bipartisan vote for the plan to be effective for the full 10-year period. And last bullet point, require that if a plan is adopted by the General Assembly without significant bipartisan support, it cannot be effective for the entire 10-year period and must comply with explicit anti-gerrymandering requirements. Shall the amendment be approved, yes or no? Over 8 out of 10 Ohioans said yes. I don't know about you, Lance, but I read that and it seems very clear to me that the people of Ohio wanted a bipartisan, non-gerrymandered map. I mean, is there some other way to interpret that relatively plain ballot language?
No, I don't think so. And for all of those listeners out there who aren't from Ohio, you're probably thinking, well, how does this affect me? Well, remember, this is going on not only in Ohio, but in New York and California and Illinois and North Carolina and Texas. And it makes up the House of Representatives, which I think we all understand the House is in charge of all money bills, including taxes and everything else. All must start in the House. And so, and you're saying, well, those states you named off, they're all pretty big. Right, which means they have more seats in the House than a lot of other states. So you're being affected by what's going on in these states, even if you're from a listener from a smaller state who only has 1, 2, or 3 representatives, and you're wondering, well, what's the big argument here? It's no problem in our state. Well, you're affected by this because all of these large states are doing things like this, and they're upsetting the balance of power in the House. And the biggest thing they're doing is they're not representing the will of the voter. And that's what we're all about. Ohio's just an example. It's going on in most of the larger states where there are multiple seats, double-digit seats in the House of Representatives. And it's just frustrating to sit here and, as Justin read that, and understand and try to wrap my head around the fact that what do these politicians not understand that the voters want? We all just want fairness.
No, they understand. They just don't like what we want, and they think that it's their job to do whatever they want that keeps them in power.
And so what I'm saying is then we need to do something about electing a group of people that will represent the wants and the desires of the electorate. What we're showing you today is that both sides are doing it. We're not bashing one side or the other. You know, in Ohio, it happens to be the Republicans who are totally disregarding the will of the people this time. And in New York, it happens to be the Democrats. But you lump them all together, they're all politicians. And in both of these states and in numerous others, they're disregarding what the people want, and that is an open and fair election. Staying away, and I don't mean to be riling up those people that were. Doesn't have anything to do with January 6th. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. Okay, this is all about. I use those phrases, and I think those phrases have been misused by those people. This is like we have a constitution in place. We went through the process. Now just follow those rules. I'm not talking about somebody getting cheated out of getting elected or not. I'm just talking about follow what the people wanted. And I'll go along with it, but you're not even setting it up here in Ohio or in New York to represent the will of those people or in those other states that I've mentioned.
The oath of office requires that our representatives in Ohio swear to uphold the Constitution of Ohio, that they'll administer justice without respect to persons and will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all of the duties that are incumbent upon them. And I mean, just the first line alone, right? I'll do what the Ohio Constitution says. I will uphold it. Well, you're not doing that. You're not doing that. And again, we're using Ohio as the example because this is where Lance and I live and we're the most familiar with it. But this is occurring in other places as well, in other states that have tried to do the same thing. Because in New York, voters there attempted something similar. And the legislator was like, we see an opportunity to do what we wanted to do, and we don't care what you said. And to Lance's point, that disenfranchises people. So what do we do about this? I mean, Lance, where do we go? And in my mind, it is all voters have to realize that if our elected representatives, and yes, that includes your representative, right? Because we've talked about that bias all the time toward, well, it's everybody else that's bad. My representative is good. No. Complicit, part of the system, if they're unwilling to literally do their job, then they got to go. They got to go. I think other states need to follow, by the way, the example of Ohio, because this isn't over yet, folks. At the time that Lance and I are doing this, the Supreme Court of Ohio is still saying, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And it's not our fault, the court's fault, that you guys didn't do what you were supposed to do by your deadline, because now, of course, the legislature in Ohio is, blaming the Supreme Court for delaying the primary. And they're like, oh, no. It's being delayed because you didn't do what the Constitution of Ohio required of you. You didn't do it. So it's your fault. So don't anybody be under the guise in these states where then they get in this whole thing of, we just have to move ahead, because we talked about that with the whole Ukraine situation, right? We get into these desperate times, and then we'd start taking measures, and it's like, well, we can't really think about all the implications because, we waited until the last minute. So now we just have to do something. Common tactic. Don't let yourself be fooled by that. And hopefully, Lance, the Supreme Court of Ohio does make sure that the will of the people are followed, because I think if they do, hopefully what's been done in Ohio might be a model for what other states can also do.
Well, I'm going to throw one at you that we're not going to have time to talk about, but that's what I like to do. And that is, we have not changed the number 435 in almost 100 years.
Change it.
And so change it what?
Change it.
Oh, yeah.
Increase.
Right. We need to increase the number of representatives. You say, what's my solution? Well, let's go, let's get a little closer to what the original Constitution said about how many people each representative is supposed to represent, because the number now is way out of proportion. And so when so many of us feel disenfranchised, and the fact that we're not being represented, it's because we've stayed at a number now for the longest period of time ever in our history. The first 150 years or so of our history, we were constantly changing the number of people in the House of Representatives. And some of you are going to say, well, it's because we added more states. Well, that's part of it, but we were trying to keep the balance, the number of people that were being represented in balance, in proportion. And then all of a sudden we've just stopped that. We haven't added a new state in, since 1959. So in the last, 63 years, we haven't added a state, but we haven't increased the number of people in the House of Representatives for almost 100, I think. I think it was back in the 1920s sometime, and I'm just trying to remember, so I'm not, looking up on my computer. So correct me if I'm wrong.
But the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, is when they fixed the number at 435 and quit adding.
Okay. So, there you go, folks. It's been more than 100 years.
We actually added, Lance, states, and didn't do anything to change
the number,
the number of people in Congress.
And so
crazy.
You want it, the people, if our goal is to have people feeling that they're more represented by their congressperson, then you increase the number of representatives in the House of Representatives. And I know that's, quote, bigger government. We have to pay more in salaries and all that kind of stuff. But if we really want, I'm trying to solve a problem here. If we want to feel more represented, then I can't be one of 12 or 15,000 or 700,000 or whatever the number is today. I don't know.
I like the idea of increasing the representation because it does help with the district issue, right? One of the issues is that there are so few, like in Ohio, you have 15 congressional districts. We have 15 congressional districts that you have to divide, and Ohio geographically is a sizable state, that gets complicated. And the more population there is, again, the less and less your representative has to listen to you, because the more of you there are per representative. So I think there's definitely merit to that. The other thing I'd like to do, Lance, because I've thought congressional pay for years is, a disaster. I think part of the way that you get representatives to be more accountable to their districts is you set their wage based on the average annual wage of their district. That's what they're paid. Why are they paid? In many cases, by the way, just the average congressman, just so that you all know, makes 3 or 4 times what the average American makes. No. Wrong. If they're supposed to represent us, how are they doing that if they don't know what people in their district really live on? And I'm not picking on just Jim Jordan here, but Jim Jordan makes an inordinately higher amount than the average person in his district. And how might he look at things differently if he made what the average person in his district makes? I think it'd be quite different. And I don't mean just with him. I'm just saying generally. I think representatives would look at it quite differently if they had to live on what their constituents live on. And they don't. They don't have to do that. And the other thing is, just like people in most districts, in most places across the United States of America, if they don't do their job, they quit getting paid. So we pay them less, and we say, oh, gee, just like everybody else in this country, you have to go to work, and you have to do your job to get paid. And if you don't, you're not getting paid. So we're going to pay you less because you don't deserve what you're getting paid anyway, because you guys are all a bunch of clowns. And number 2, you're not even going to get to keep the measly amount that you are paid if you don't do your frickin' job. And if we have more representatives, Lance, we lower what they're paid, we can afford more representatives without drastically changing the total budget for Congress. So there you go.
All right. Well, let us know what you think. We haven't asked you for that on this show, but email us at podcast@thestateofus.org. Tell us what your solution would be and whether you agree with what Justin and I are saying or not, because that's what it's all about here at True Chat. Our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And if you've enjoyed today's show or you haven't, please participate and share the ideas with others and see what they think, and tell them they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays in the morning as a podcast, and that same show is heard on the weekends across the United States on AM and FM radio stations. I think Lance takes the win today on
I think I threw
vaunt.
a shutout. Not to be vaunting, but I think I threw a shutout.
Yeah, you think so?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll let Bradley decide.
Now that baseball season is getting ready to start,
Warming up that arm.
I am. I'm
getting it ready.
Yep.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, in the great state of Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to Bradley Butch, our producer, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.